Well, thank you, Magda. And we're so pleased to have David Clutterbuck, who is a renowned coach, mentor, supervisor, and team coach and author over 100 books. He's co-founder of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. He has held his own practice. He's been a member of the Institute of Directors and with the CIPD, and he has been chairman of the International Standards for Mentoring Programs in Employment. And David, what I hadn't realized is that you and I have a connection through Lenny Wildflower.
Oh, yeah.
So you have your PhD from the University of London on mentoring. And I just learned that you are doing, overseeing a research committee with the London Comedy Club. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that because that sounds so unique.
Okay. So before we look at the results of the poll while that's coming in, so if anybody's not filled in the poll, please do now. And then in a moment, when it's all done, Karen will tell me that it's ready to share.
Yes.
But yes, yeah. my role with the London School of Comedy is, and it's only 70 books, not 100 yet. I'm working on it.
Okay.
But it's my role with London School of Comedy is to oversee the research committee, which is looking at the well-being uses of laughter to keep kids out of knife crime, to help people with depression to get their lives back together by learning how to laugh at themselves and to laugh at the world. And I think that we as coaches, laughter is something that is a tremendous tool in our armory. We know that the coaching sessions where there's a lot of laughter tend to be coaching sessions where there's a lot of learning. So that's certainly the background of that. And I have a big project at the moment, which I'm really enthusiastic about, which is to try and we have the aim of achieving 5 million school-age coaches and mentors.
Wonderful.
So we're trying to get kids around the world to learn the skills of coaching and mentoring before they enter the workforce rather than after. So that's occupying a lot of my time, but it's an ambitious project, but one that I have enormous enthusiasm for. If anybody wants to hear more about it, we can do that separately outside of the webinar. So, do we have the result of the poll yet?
Magda,
yep, I'm going to end that now. I accidentally reset the poll, but the results are the same. It just looks like 55 voted, but I assure you everyone has voted. And I'm sharing the results now.
So this is
so we have 40% who identify as coach, 2% identify as mentor, and 60% identify as coach and mentor.
That's brilliant. So to some extent, it looks like for many, I'm preaching to the converted, and that's wonderful. Thank you very much for taking that. So that helps to shape the way that I'll carry on. So let's move into the first of the slide. I think there's a lot of myths about coaching and mentoring, and particularly about mentoring. The reality is that neither coaching or mentoring is about telling people what to do. It's about helping them examine their actions in the light of their intentions. Put it another way, both of them are about helping people with the quality of their thinking. And that's the core of both coaching and mentoring. And it's not surprising because coaching essentially comes from mentoring. And the history of that we're going into in a moment. But let's look at the next slide, because coaching we can describe as mentoring we can describe as coaching plus. In our investigations and researches of what professional coaches do and professional mentors do, it's quite clear that if you understand the world of the other person, if you've to some extent walked in their shoes or similar shoes, you can often ask much more powerful, more insightful questions, more provoking questions, because you understand their world. And also, we find that if you don't understand their world, sometimes you can make awful mistakes. We had a coach who was working with somebody in banking who didn't understand anything about insider dealing. and ended up colluding unconsciously, unknowingly, with the client in doing something highly illegal, because they didn't know enough about the client's world to keep them safe. And I think that there are some real issues here about, how much do you as a coach or as a mentor need to understand the world of your client in order to be effective and safe. There's also, we find, particularly at the most senior levels, there's a preference very often for chief executives to have a mentor rather than a coach, because they want somebody who's been there and seen it and done it and been in the same chair and had that same experience, particularly the loneliness of being a chief executive where the buck stops here. And if you can tell stories, if you have anecdote that you can use in an appropriate way, and that's not telling old war stories and constantly think this is what happened to me type of thing, or I remember when, but use the appropriate use of story can help you make concepts which are otherwise difficult to explain, bring them to life because you can put them into context. But the downside of having knowledge of the other person's world or experience that goes before is that you may have to sometimes put that aside, because you've been there before. So the answer that comes to mind is that so you want to give them the answers to what they should do. That's not helpful. The whole point of both coaching and mentoring is to help the person find answers that are suitable for them and align with their values, their situations, and their aspirations, not those of the coach or the mentor. So let's look at the origin on the next slide. Let's look at where coaching and mentoring come from. And we can basically say mentoring is older, it's wiser, and has a much longer history of non-directive questionings than does coaching. Let's just look at where coaching comes from first. No, let's keep back on the previous slide, please. No, that's it. So basically, coaching originates in the mid-1850s. So it's not much more than 150 years old. And it was in the first mention we have of coaching is in a novel by a novelist called Thackeray. And the coach was an expensive tutor who was assigned to get dim students or students who spent most of their time drinking instead of studying through their examinations at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And the coach was basically there. The comparison was a coach as it was called, was a kind of horse-drawn carriage, which was very, very expensive. The word coach comes from Hungarian. And the idea was that you would drag people through their exams like they were being pulled through by a coach and horses. The next iteration we see of coaching is in rowing, where the coach was somebody who would do as a traditional sports coach would do, would gallop along the pow path, because they didn't have bicycles then, and shout instructions at the rowers. Then it moved to tennis, and for a long time until the early 1970s, in sports coaching in particular, coaching was entirely a directive telling people what to do process. Then Tim Galway came along and recognized from his work that you could actually get more out of people. They could learn better if you actually focused on the learning, them on controlling the learning process. And so strange from the whole tennis process, tennis became the vehicle by which then coaching emerged from the sports world into the world of executives and the much wider world of human ambition. By contrast, mentoring starts 2.5, nearly 3,000 years ago with the goddess, or the tales of the goddess Athena in the Odyssey. And the goddess Athena was the first mentor. She accompanied Odysseus and his son Telemachus on their journeys of discovery as they left home, went seeking on a journey, and eventually came home much wiser people. And what Athena did, as the goddess of wisdom, was let them have an experience, and they would typically come away feeling very sore from that experience, and then sit down with them and have a dialogue that they could learn from what had happened. And so basically, her role was to help them return home much wiser, more grown-up people than they left. And the whole history of mentoring has been one of this non-directive questioning, helping people to learn. It was embedded very deeply in European tradition by a cleric in France called Fenelon in the reign of King Louis, the Sun King, who continued the dialogues of Athena with Telemachus as a means of trying to educate the Sun King himself, King Louis. It wasn't appreciated in France, but across the rest of Europe, it was seen as a revelation that you could actually help people learn better by having a dialogue. In fact, Fenelon was the first leadership writer in Europe, perhaps with the exception of Machiavelli. So the history of coaching and mentoring is intertwined. And in terms of the professional development of coaches and mentors, there really isn't that much difference in what coaches and mentors do, except the mentors have this larger reservoir of relevant experience, and mentors are more likely to be role models to the mentee. So the origins, the two things are not that dissimilar. And in fact, in our work with professional coaches who have wanted to transition to being professional mentors as well, we found that most of them are already using mentoring principles and mentoring approaches in their work. They find there is a seamless transition between one and the other. And this is, I think, a highly positive thing. The critical word here is wisdom. And let's look at the next slide and look at the different kinds of wisdom. So there's lean wisdom, which is very specific around a task or a context. So you can be very wise about, some aspect of computer programming or the legal profession or any particular area of domain of expertise. But that's not very transferable. You've got broad wisdom, which is about living life and actually reflecting and learning from your life, both your own and other people's. And then you've got meta wisdom, and that's about how you bring together all sorts of multiple shifting perspectives and create much broader, deeper understanding of things. And very few people have meta wisdom, or not in great supply. But if you're familiar with the stages of adult development, you would know that meta wisdom is something that you would see in people who are at Kegan's highest level of personal development. It's also related, wisdom is related, we can describe wisdom as the learning that you take from reflection on experience. And if we look at the next slide, we can look at the whole process of reflection on learning. So you basically, reflective learning is how you think about the context and the meaning of an experience. What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? Who was involved? How did I feel about it? What didn't happen? What did I notice and what did I not notice? And then thinking about the lessons you can extract from that experience. Then reflective learning, you think about how to use or apply those lessons. And then finally, the thing that actually embeds the reflective learning and turns it from just reflection and into wisdom is thinking about the process of learning, how you learned from this experience, and what you can do to incorporate that process of learning more formally in how you grow in the future and how you act and behave in the future. So I think this whole process of reflective learning, it's fundamental to what we do with our clients, but it's also fundamental to what we do with ourselves. When we've had a coaching session, we're going to take something to supervision. Have we actually reflected deeply enough on what we're talking about or what would have happened to us? So let's have a little poll here. We've got next on the next slide. We're talking about context here. So if you've got a client and you've got some information that will be helpful to them in making a better decision, should you not give them that information because coaches don't give advice, or should you give it to them, or is it something that depends on the circumstances?
Hi, everyone. Just so you know, the poll is actually on your screen, so please vote.
I think the answer to these will be very interesting.
Absolutely. I have no idea what the answer is going to be. So,
Got about 60% who voted.
Great.
Let's get a few more and then I will end the poll.
Okay.
All right, last chance to vote, everyone.
All right. Can you see? It depends, got 61%,
Yeah,
followed
you're
by
doing
no.
right.
And yes, it's 19.
um, okay. I'm going to give you my personal view, and that is that um, it does depend, but what it depends upon is what is in service of the client. And we've seen lots of situations where people have known stuff, but have just simply, but have refrained from telling it to the client because they think falsely that they shouldn't help them. They shouldn't give them information or tell them anything. But that's actually, if the client is damaged by this, that is not ethical. I think we might have some things in the chat room. Let's see what we have here. So you may do it by invitation. That's brilliant. Yes. May I give you some information that you don't have? And that would be a great thing to do. I think a coach's job is to help whatever it takes. Yes. And then somebody said, no, because anything that would provide a more useful, productive dialogue, which will benefit the client, is not to be ignored. Okay. Yeah. So this is all. So those are the main things we've got. Anybody else want to take anything? Do you phrase it in a certain way, David? I tend to phrase it in various ways. There's a lovely YouTube video of me asking somebody, saying to somebody, I've got an example here of something that's happened to somebody else that I think might be really helpful for you in this circumstance. Is it okay for me to share it with you? And the guy says, yes, okay. So I share this information, and then I say, was that useful? And he says, no. I say, okay, that's fine. Let's move on. And then about 2 minutes later, he says, oh my God, I've just realized how relevant that is. And I think that so you know, you can have, it isn't always immediately obvious. And so sometimes the client just needs a nudge to somebody from Metil. That's brilliant. Yes, exactly. Somebody else put, what boundaries have been contracted? And somebody else puts, no, as you can opt to put your coach's hat off for a while. I think this coach's hat, his coach's off, but the coach's hat, I assume. Yes, sometimes you can contract to step out of coaching mode. And I think, so basically what we're saying is you don't have to be rigid about your coaching. It's what is going to be in the service of the client. And that's much more important than trying to stick to some rigid idea of what we're trying to do as a coach. It's a bit like this myth that we have to, about having to set and stick to clear goals in coaching. Actually, most of the time, the goal that we set, if you're doing a really good job as a coach and you help somebody understand themselves, their own values, and they understand the circumstances better, there's research that shows in almost all cases, if you've done coaching well, the client's goal will change. So, so it's the context we give them really helps them to do this. Some other comments here, just because we're deviating from ethics in a view to help the client may not be necessarily seen as unethical. Yeah. Yeah, is it okay to, so different ways of rephrasing it. Brilliant. What if there's a conflict of interest between the sponsor's goal and the client's? Brilliant. That comes down the contracting in the beginning. One of the things that I always do is contract with the sponsor that the probability is that the goal will change and that they should expect that to happen. And we'll tell them when it happens. And most of the time that's accepted. Thank you all for your comments. They're brilliant comments. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Let's look a bit more at the context and so forth. So the process of coaching and mentoring are both about co-learning and co-creation. So there's information that's going around, which information they have, information we have. There's context that they have, which they need to share with you, but also context you have. There's insight which you provoke into them, but sometimes listening to them, you get an insight which enables you to ask more powerful questions. Then there's the whole thing of intent. What is the purpose if you're going to share information, or what is the purpose of the questions that you ask when you do so? And that's what contributes to co-learning. One of the things points I frequently make is there's no such thing as a non-directive conversation. The moment you choose which question to ask or not ask, you have taken some measure of control. So it is, there is always an element of directiveness in a conversation all we try and do is minimize that directiveness. So let's look at the next slide, which looks at the developmental conversation in a different way. What we're trying to do in coaching and mentoring both is to help somebody firstly understand their internal context. And you can see all the things here, the values they hold, their strengths and weaknesses, the level of self-confidence and self-awareness they have, what is their purpose in life, their purpose in the business, their skills, their personality, experience, etc., etc. There's loads of things which are about who they are, and not just the person that they are, but the person they were and the person they aim to become. So all of these things are about the internal understanding of themselves. And it's quite typical for clients to have a very low understanding of their internal world. And then there's the external context. So these are what might happen, the learning opportunities for them, who might support them in their career, what reputation they have, the people that can go to for support, the networks, the career opportunities that they might be able to pursue, etc., etc. Who they can learn from, masses of things that influence them in terms of what they can do. Very often the biggest constriction on an individual's performance is their boss, for example. So all of the external context is something that constrains people. And when we're coaching people, you cannot coach the individual on their own. You have to coach them within the context of their systems. And both how they influence the systems around them and how those systems influence them. Coaching and mentoring are a conversation that helps them link that external context with that internal context. So it's about doing and planning, performing, it's about understanding, it's about self-awareness, it's about all of these things. And basically we can say that in general, as a coach, we might put slightly more emphasis on the internal context. And as a mentor, we might put slightly more emphasis on the external context, but we're talking no more than 60-40 here. But I think it's quite useful to look at that, the kind of changes that we're trying to make, because if we're trying to get changes in behavior, then we would want to put more emphasis on the internal context. And certainly that would be one of the critical areas of coaching. If we're trying to help somebody work out where do I go with my career, you would put more emphasis on the external world, and that would be more broadly associated with mentoring. But I say more broadly associated because these are not mutually exclusive. The two keep crossing over into each other. So we call it a developmental conversation, and it's about linking that internal context with that external context, and the efficiency with which the person is able to do that depends upon the quality of the coaching conversation or the coaching dialogue that we hold with them. So let's look a little bit at what we mean by this. So let's actually, we've got the other thing for the chat room. So when have you ever felt it appropriate to give a client context? Let's have your views. Let's see what we got.
One is to bring clarity and to create awareness when the client is asking explicitly for some help. When the sponsor makes clear that the client needs to conform to the system.
Yes. Yeah. Agree with that. Yes.
When there's a feeling that they're inexperienced and not exposed and they fully don't understand something before, giving context or calling a sharing perspective is critical. When they've been contracted for it. A question for you is in group coaching, David. Any thoughts on how best to understand the internal context as different from the one-to-one session?
I think this is a great question. It could probably take an hour to answer it. First thing I would say, are we talking about a group or a team? But let's assume we mean a work group who are either a team or on the way to becoming a team, or have some of the characteristics of a team. So they have to have high levels of interdependency. Basically, it's the shared narrative that they have. And one of the things that we do, I'm just teaching a team coaching course here in Hong Kong at the moment. We do people, how close is the narrative that people tell themselves about the purpose and the role and the processes, the history of this team to each other? Do they have a similar narrative, or do they have different narratives? That can be really revealing as we dig into that. Yeah, when the conversation can go in several directions, yes. So you help the person to choose the context, what would be the most productive thing for them. So there's lots of, can everybody read, I'm sure everybody can read the chat room. So
there's another good one: when the client is not able to progress at all and keeps coming back to the not.
Yes.
KNOT, not.
Yeah. When they're stuck. And I think, yeah, when somebody's stuck, they need a different perspective. Now, there are cool tools and techniques that we have that help them through questioning. But sometimes, though, if those don't work, then we have to go back to give them some information that will help them to go a bit further. Certainly, the tool that we mostly use, we've done research into the nature of questioning by coaches and mentors, and we find that you can do a matrix, which basically the matrix includes one level is intellectual and the other one is emotional. The other is stepping in, where you're helping them see things from their own perspective, and stepping out where you see things from other people's perspective. And what we found is a great way to get people to move, to unpick the knot, for example, is to take them, whatever quadrant they're in, to move them to another one, and then to another one on. And eventually they do create the external perspective for themselves. If they can't do that, then you need to give them some information that will help them see things differently. There are some lovely comments here. There's one here about the internal context when the client's clapped in between the two environment, the things. Yeah, particularly when the organization's values don't vibe with your own, when the organization is expressing different values to your own. Then what does somebody do apart from just quit? Somebody's asking different boundaries between mentoring and coaching. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. Okay. So let's move on, because there's lots of wonderful comments, and I'm sure we can send them, make sure everybody gets those. And I think this comment, we've already sort of referred to this. The more experienced the coaches, the more they're happy to blur the boundaries between coaching and mentoring. And that's quite clear from all of the research that we've done around this and the experiences that we've had. So let's just look at what we mean by mentoring. So let's get a bit more down to down and dirty, if you like. This is one definition. So mentoring is a helping relationship. It's based on an exchange of knowledge, experience, and goodwill. So whereas coaching tends to be more one-way learning, but although really good coaches learn every time they have a coaching assignment, but mentoring tends to be more two-way. And we say mentors help somebody less experienced gain confidence, clearer purpose, insight, and wisdom. So there's that word wisdom again. And in developmental mentoring, the mentor too is changed by the relationship. So that's one definition. Let's look at another one, which is on the next slide. So helping somebody with the quality of their thinking about issues that are important to them is both mentoring and coaching. But we would see a focus in coaching mainly on performance and skills issues, and a focus in mentoring on career and the more broader holistic development, helping somebody to grow up and mature. Now, this is not a nice big red line between the two. There is multiple overlap. And that's why it becomes so difficult to draw clear water between them. But, should we worry about it? No. I think when we come back to what do we need to do in service to the client, we do whatever is appropriate, and we draw on our skills as coach, we draw on our skills as mentor, so that we give the client what they need at this time in their development. So if we look at mentoring versus coaching in the next slide, we can get a bit of a clearer idea. So mentoring sort of, primarily opens up new perspectives and new horizons. It's got mutual benefits for the mentee and the mentor, and it tends to be a longer term relationship. Whereas coaching tends to target performance in a particular area, and that could be in your life, for example, life coaching, a particular aspect of your life. It's much more focused on clear goals and specific skills and behavior around those. It's primarily for the benefit of the coachee, and it tends more often to be short-term around specific goals and objectives. But of course, I keep using the word tend because that's really, it is not as black and white as it might be. And we can look at it too in terms, and the next slide, we can go a bit deeper. So there's a lot of similarities between developmental coaching and mentoring. They both focus on the quality of the learner's thinking. Both coaches and mentor use their experience to craft powerful questions. You can use advice in the last resort. We did some research in an organization. We found that the thing that most annoyed coachees about their coaches was whenever they didn't know what to do and they just wanted a simple piece of direction and pointing in the right way to go by the coach would say things to them, well, if you did have the answer, what do you think it might be? One person described it, he said, my coach constantly did this to me. Said at one point we were sitting opposite each other on a desk and there was a pencil in the middle of the desk. And he did it for fourth or fifth time, he said, and I kept looking at that pencil and thinking, I'm going to stick that up his nose in a minute. He was so frustrated. And I think he's just stuck with me. It's a very graphic image. Much of the learning of coaching and mentoring takes place between sessions. It's not just what happens in the session. And of course, there's this duty of care that both coaches and mentors have. But mentors are more likely to make introductions. They're more likely to help people develop networks too. Mentors are more likely to help explain the politics of an organization or a profession. I'm sure for many of them, there won't be any politics in your organizations, ha ha. Coaches are more likely to give feedback, whereas a mentor, because they are not observing the workplace context, would tend not to be in a position to do that, and they might give feedback in terms of how they are experiencing the learner in the session. But apart from that, they would not do that. Then coaching tends to be more of an assignment or an activity focused on performance, whereas mentoring tends to be more of a long-term relationship. Now, again, these are tendencies. They are not absolute differences. And we can always find examples of one of the others. Somebody's asking, can we have a copy of the slide deck? Yes, that's perfectly okay. That's fine by me. So if Karen,
yes, we can make that available, David, because we'll have this is being recorded and replayed. So thank you. We'll make sure that happens. I do have a question just by the last couple of slides. So are you also indicating that as a mentor with this experience of having walked in the client's shoes, so to speak, because you're familiar with either the industry or the function, can the mentor coach, is it more likely that they're coming either from inside or can they be truly outside and offer the same level of mentor coaching?
Oh, that's an interesting thing. There's been some research on comparing internal coaches versus external coaches. There's been a meta study of this, and interestingly, it concludes that internal coaches tend to be more effective overall than external coaches. That's quite frightening, isn't it?
Yes.
And it provides a number of reasons for it. It's one piece of research, so we shouldn't take it. It's just one piece of research, and before we take that too seriously, we'd want to see it backed up by at least 2 or 3 other studies. But it is indicative that we should not underplay. If somebody's been through coach training and has the same level of qualification, just being inside the organization doesn't mean that they are less effective. And it does give them the benefits that they understand the memes, the culture of the organization, so they have some insights that maybe an external person doesn't. What we've started to do a lot is to include internal and external coaches and the same internal and external mentors in the same supervision groups. And so we get the interplay and the two educate each other. And that's a very powerful way of developing the ability and the competence of both parties.
Yeah.
And my sense is that organizations need to have a mix of internal and external coaches, because if you just have internal coaching or internal mentoring, it becomes very, it's navel gazing. You need the external perspective as well. So it's the two things together. It's a bit like if you want to create a coaching culture in an organization, if you want to get line managers to be good coaches to their direct reports, or to use coaching behaviors with their direct reports, the best way of doing it is to give them responsibilities as a mentor and train them as a mentor, because they can use the same basic skills and tools and techniques, but they're using them on somebody who's not a direct report, so that they can experiment more and they can actually get more comfortable because there's not so much at stake.
Great. Do you want to look at some questions now, or you want to proceed with the slide?
Let's see what else there is. Yeah.
Okay. This meaning chat. Oh, wait. So no, those aren't our questions. I thought they were. Let's proceed.
Okay, let's carry on then. Okay, so one of the things we've got people like Google mentoring, but all sorts of people are using the word mentoring and coaching in ways that they're not meant to be. They're just attaching the label to anything. So one of the things that we've been pushing back upon is this, what I call fast knowledge transfer. So it's where you just dial an expert, basically. So we've been promoting a name for this kind of information exchange, which has no relationship related to it. We call it FKT, or fast knowledge transfer. And it has lots of benefits. You get immediate response because there's a load of experts out there that you can go to. And if you've got a problem on your computer and you want to find an expert, you can do it very easily. Go to an expert website, and somebody will say, "Well, for $10, I'll tell you what to do." That's great. It's useful. We can all do with that. All you need there is some subject expertise. You don't need any skills of teaching or coaching or mentoring to pass on information. And I compare it to a one-night stand. There's no relationship. It's Tinder for information exchange. We have one multinational organization where they're talking about whether they should call this FKT based upon the fact that it's quite funny if you say the acronym FAST. I'm not going to go there, but well, I am. Yes, I mean Fugit is actually quite a description for it, but I don't know whether it's going to catch on. But by contrast, on the next slide, mentoring and coaching too, you get two-way learning from mentoring. It's not just about the problem, but on the learning you can take away from working on that problem. In addition to technical knowledge, there's self-knowledge. There's the role modeling. It leads to deeper levels of change in the way you think and the way you behave, and sometimes it will lead to personal transformation. And the mentor takes the mentee works with the mentee over the journey of the transitions they're making as they apply the learning they have. This thing about getting behind the presented issue is not just, this is my problem, how do I solve it? But how did this issue arrive? Is this something that's a pattern, for example? You can get much more deeply into things. So it's like a strategic perspective as well as the short-term tactical perspective. We're helping people to learn to reflect on their experience. And we find that both that mentoring and coaching can be really valuable for an organization in their corporate strategy for objectives like diversity. I mean, the best way to actually increase diversity in an organization is to provide mentoring programs for people from minority backgrounds. And you build the networks of trust because through introductions to a mentor. So all of these things at mentoring, and to some extent coaching, also add. Coaching also brings great benefits in the same way, but I've just focused on mentoring here for the moment. If we look at the mentoring conversation in the next slide, then we can see that the process is one that actually is very similar to what we might expect if we had a free-flowing coaching conversation where we weren't trying to conform to a model. And I think one of the things that we find is that we get quite basic, low-level coaching when people try and stick to the GROW model, for example. It's interesting that Sir John Whitmore, before he died, in an interview said that he wished he hadn't called it the GROW model because the goal is not it should have been vision, rather than for V for Vero, but that didn't make a word. And I think if we have a mechanical process where we've got to follow that process, we've got some real problems. And what we found from observing hundreds of mentors is that the same process actually also make coaching conversations more effective. So the first thing you do is establish the right kind of environment, relaxed professional learning environment. Sometimes laughter is one of the things we use to do that. Then we spend probably 80% of the conversation understanding the context. What do they know and what do they not know? Who's involved? What patterns are there, and so forth. And then the mentor tends to summarize what they've heard. and that gives the mentees a chance to say, well, no, there's more to it than that. All the effective mentors, the most effective ones, then do something to help the mentee build their own self-belief they can deal with whatever the issue they've raised. Finally, they start work on the solution, what the mentee wants to do with that information. It might not be a solution, it might be just something they go away and think about, but it has to be congruent with their values. And then we found this big difference between effective mentors and ineffective mentors. The ineffective mentors summarize again. They then take all the responsibility back on their shoulders. The effective mentors get the mentee to summarize so that the mentee takes ownership, and the mentor can sense whether or not they really have got to the place where they feel where they need to be in the conversation. So there's a whole range of issues here within the mentoring conversation. Now, before I get on to the next bits, I'm just going to pull on some of the questions, the things that have been asked here. There's one is about coaching being more mentoring and coaching being holistic. I think coaching tends to focus on a specific issue that somebody brings. And whereas mentoring tends to be much more holistic in it's looking at somebody in the much longer future. But it's not always that way, but it's a tendency. I think this one is about, I tend to be explicit about the differences. I do offer more advice in mentoring to my knowledge of context. I think if you try and you lose the word advice, basically, because advice is telling, this is what I think you should do. If you give context, this is what might be helpful for you to know, so you can make your own decision about what you should do. If you give advice, you're suggesting that the solution that would work for you is the one that would work for them. And that's not really very helpful. So neither mentors nor coaches should ever give advice, except in the very last resort, when somebody's going to do something that's really dangerous or harmful to themselves and others. It's an interesting one about the mentoring leaning towards the sponsor's objectives versus coaching leaning into the client's objectives. I don't see that difference at all. In fact, more often we see it the other way around. Again, I think it's something that depends upon circumstance. So what's one of the other things?
David,
yeah, go ahead.
With your permission, with just one comment and then there's a question to follow. I think many of the questions people have as coaches is probably somewhat an incorrect understanding of what the IC of competencies stand for, which we find when we work with people at the mastery level, because even in those competencies, it's very much allowed for the coach to notice and reflect and comment on what they feel about what the coach has said, the intuitive understanding and expression of that. And it tremendously contributes to the client's progress. And someone asked here about, why did you say that mentoring is more holistic? I think it's probably one of these things where we somehow feel as coaches, at least an early level of understanding of competencies, that this advice is a bad word, whatever number of words that are in there. The other is my own understanding of this deepened. You mentioned the word supervision somewhere, that when I went into supervision, at that point in time, the clarity with which one understood that the supervisor can in fact share the reflections and should in fact share the reflections and establish a relationship with the client made a huge difference to me in terms of learning about moving forward. I just want you to sort of, if you are going to cover something of that later on.
I don't think we're going to have a lot of time to do that, but I think I think responding to that and to this question about, there's a question here about the mentoring conversation is what I was doing before my ICF mastery level and had to let go of by summarizing and fact finding. I think that is absolutely correct. As we become more experienced as both coaches and as mentors, we let go, or we basically allow the conversation to go where it will. And in our observation of hundreds of coaches in their practice, we find that they actually move as they become more and more competent and achieve mastery. They move from doing coaching very early stages. You do coaching to people, you then do coaching with people, you then integrate who you are, your identity, with what you do as a coach, so you become a coach, is being a coach. And finally, at the most mature level, we find that people, you basically hold the client while the client has the conversation they need to have with themselves. And so what you're trying to do here, basically, and as a coach, as a senior coach, holding somebody where they have the conversation with themselves, that we find that is exactly the same as what the most experienced coaches do, and the most experienced mentors do. We can't see a real difference between them in the kind of conversation they hold, except for what's the purpose, what's the issue that we're trying to deal with. And so the mentoring conversation, as I've expressed it here, is it's what we teach mentors to start with, so that they've got some sense of progress in the conversation. But of course, as you get more mature, as you get more involved with it and learn to relax and not need the process, you can leave that behind just as you would as a more mature coach. So I'm conscious we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to whip through the last bits that I've got, if I may. These are some of the competencies we found with a mentor. There's nothing here that I think would be people would not expect. The business professional savvy, been there, seen it, done it. That's the obvious thing. Sense of proportion and humor is important. Conceptual modeling is basically being able to share ways of thinking. So 2x2 matrices or something that will help somebody understand an issue in a different way. So it's not telling them how they should think about it, but giving them a framework to think about it. And then the mentors can be a role model too. We're networking. Mentors would help people build their networks as well. They would help them in mentoring as networks. There's a variety of things that you might do. So there's influence networks, how you get things done. Information networks, finding out what's going out there on the world. There's lots to say about networking, but I think the critical thing is that it requires generosity. The more that you try and give to people in your network, the more they will give to you. And learning the skills of being a great networker, I think the mentors act as role models for that. And mentors, being a role model, it's an important issue. And we ask people, what would you be a good role model for? People struggle. And what we find is the things that you see as your greatest weaknesses, maybe the things that you are greatest to help them with, because you have, you've got good coping strategies for those things in order to succeed yourself. So you can empathize much better with them because you've had to work at those things that you see as weaknesses. And if they've got the same weakness, but they're far further down the path of development, that gives you greater insights, and you can be much more helpful for them in developing their own coping strategies, not taking on yours wholesale, but developing coping strategies of their own. I think that's really quite important. One quick, brief, more chat room question, and I don't think we're going to get through everything, but that's the nature of these conversations. So, what are your thoughts about the plus and minuses of being a role model for your coaching clients?
So I'll look as people answer.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that mentors offer context and coaches explore context?
I think they will both explore it, but more mentors are more likely to offer it.
Okay. And coaches help explore.
Yeah.
Clients may become more submissive.
If you are a role model for them, yeah, that may be an issue.
The minus is you may not have the experience to role model in the business context. And does impact of the role of equality, if they believe that they're a role model, does that make the decision making weaker?
Yeah, there's a slide later on that shows the process that people go through. But they tend to see somebody as a role model, and they would want to be like them. And gradually they grow up and realize that they don't want to do that. They want to be like themselves. They just want to take what they need from that person. So I think that's why we have to be so careful that both mentoring and coaching don't have a big power differential, because that's when it becomes a dangerous thing.
One here is being a role model to your coaching clients. The minus is you're taking away from the internal context, which is essentially what coaching is all about. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a danger. Yeah. So I think it's much more difficult to be a role model, or there's more dangers in being a role model as a coach than as a mentor.
And clients may be limited by the achievements and potential they have.
Yes. So all of these things. So these are wonderful comments. But basically what they illustrate is role modeling can be very helpful, but it's something to be used with great care.
Yeah. One of the questions, and I know you want to get to the end, but this is a burning question I think that many people will have. The EMCC fundamental philosophy is different than ICF. Can you comment on that?
Basically, the MCC philosophy comes from two bases. It comes from one from an evidence base. So we were born in the universities with the academics, or a mixed, or a common of bringing together the academics and their research. And so, what actually can we prove? What do we know for sure, and what do we just rather than just assume? And it also comes from practitioners in companies who are buying and coaching and mentoring, and using coaching and mentoring within organizations. So it comes from those two communities, and then the coaches and the practitioners were the third leg, if you like, who were added into that later. Whereas I think all the other coaching bodies have been set up to work with for the benefit of the coaching practitioner. And so they come from a somewhat different place. And of course, the MCC also incorporates mentoring into its as part of many mentors as mentors, as well as people mentors, as well as coaches and mentors. So I think those are the primary places that the two organisations differ. I think I think this particular slide we've pretty much said your weaknesses can be the things that are the most helpful for you. This little so let's skip over these and let's sort of get towards the end, and we'll so we can. This basically describes just the cycle that we talked about. Very often, we go through this process. It's very obvious. You admire them, you try and be like them. Then you sort of grow beyond that. You see the weaknesses in it, and then you become much clearer about what you do want to take from them and you don't. And then you step away and you're grateful to them for what they've given you, but you no longer see them in quite the same admiration way. You see them in a much more realistic way. And what's great is that as we become more used to using role models, we go through this process much more quickly. Okay, so there's many other things that we do. Can say about mentors and coaching. Mentors tend to be a sounding board. So this is when context comes in an important part of it, especially on professional issues. Mentors and great leaders, we've done some research on the literature in mentors and the literature on leaders, and it seems that they both have these three key qualities: compassion, and that includes compassion for yourself, a great curiosity, they're really interested in other people, and the courage to ask those really difficult questions, the courage to question yourself as well. Those qualities seem to be the same as well. And this, building on this use of yourself, I think this applies to both coaches and mentors, and we put it here in the coach context here, but how do you use yourself? So firstly, you might interpret something that's been said from your perspective, but then if you are really capable, you try and understand it from the client perspective, then from lots of people's perspectives, and you understand it, then you integrate those to make it holistic. But what you're doing is integrating your own knowledge and your wisdom, and basically using yourself, the wisdom that you have, to help somebody else grow wisdom in themselves. We're back to that definition of mentoring. Mentors use a lot of metaphor and story, but war stories aren't helpful. And so we have to be very careful about how we choose them. And one of the things that we train mentors to do is decide when you're going to use story and when not. And if you read the Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, you'll see that the journey of discovery that people make is one where a mentor or a coach, somebody who accompanies you on that journey, really helps you by helping you to create your own narrative. And I think it's this narrative that we create by using other narratives is an important part of the package. But again, we use it very sparingly. And so we've got basically, there's a whole movement now. Ethical mentors is a whole movement within the financial services sector, the health services, and everywhere else, where we take existing coaches, we give them some additional mentoring skills, and we also give them an understanding of the psychology of ethicality, so they can work with people who've got ethical dilemmas and help them to resolve those. This is a growing movement, and something that, and this is basically the ethical mentoring dialogue has these 6 elements. We get them to understand the problem, to consider the context, and we're back into context again, implications, we look at other perspectives, balance the arguments, and then to check, does all this make sense? There's a lot more behind this, but the process is basically one of helping somebody to think more ethically. So I don't know, we presented some ideas here. Some of these things you may agree with or disagree with, but the whole, I think what I'm trying to do is to stimulate some thinking and some ideas in you that might make you think, well, does it, and about your role as a coach, your role as a mentor, and actually, does it matter which you're playing? My view is that actually, as long as you're clear about what you're trying to achieve and it's in the service of the client, no, it doesn't. But what's changing your thinking? And if we have time for a few last comments, be interesting to see what you think.
Well, I think this is a comment. EMCC is evidence-based practice versus ICF, which is practice-based evidence.
I don't know how to interpret that. I think we come from different places. The ICF, I think the ICF has done some wonderful work, and it's certainly put coaching on the map all over the world. But I think I don't know how to interpret that basically. Both of the organizations have a lot to offer coaches, but I think all of the coaching organizations are trying to work together. We have the General Council for Mentoring and Coaching, which tries to bring us all together to try to get common standards, common ways of thinking about things. I think there is a gradual integration between all the professional bodies, and I'm very pleased to see that. Yeah.
And then the other last question, because we do have to close, is mentoring really a more mature form of coaching?
I think if you want to define it that way, yes. But I think, but it's and it's the way that I might define it, if I were pushed. But I'm very reluctant to put too many stakes in the ground. I think this is something that's constantly evolving, and I basically see the boundaries between coaching and mentoring blurring continuously, and maybe that's a good thing. maybe coaching needs to come back to its roots in mentoring, and we can and the two things can be coalesced much more effectively. That's an argument for other people to make rather than myself, but I think it's great that the two things are there to support each other. And in an organizational context, if you have coaching without mentoring, it's much less effective, and if you have mentoring without coaching, it's much less effective. So having the two things together and not worrying too much about which mode you're in, that seems to be pretty good.
Well, thank you, David. And I'll turn it back over to Magna.
Thank you so much, David. This was wonderful. Thank you for the thought-provoking talk. And thanks, everyone, for your comments and questions. We are going to finish for now. If anybody would like to come back for our next session, we will get started in about 12 minutes. And you should come back because it will be quite fascinating. Our next talk will be on virtual reality and remote coaching. So I hope to see you back here at this exact same login. But for now, we will pause for a quick break and talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, David.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.